too often been done in silos, with great focus on a narrow area of expertise. But through shared knowledge and access to data, wider problems can be solved. From inequality to sustainability, from helping our ageing population to better ways of raising our children. It's that spark of an idea, disrupting what we know. By thinking differently, our behaviour will change. This research is already happening. But now there is a new home in Cardiff that brings it together. A place open to the world that celebrates and encourages innovative thinking, collaborative working, and sharing ideas. The world's first social science research park. Spark. A spark to change our futures.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Phil Swan. I'm one of the business development managers within the CPD unit at Cardiff University. It's great to have you all here with us this morning. I can see that people are continuing to arrive. So just going to take a few moments to welcome you and introduce you to the 2022 Virtual Summer School. Since the start of the COVID pandemic, we've organised 2 successful years of this summer school. The idea came about as a way of trying to give something back to industry, third and public sector at a time when conferences and courses, face-to-face courses, were being cancelled. Needless to say, it was very well received. So we've organised it again for 2021 and then again for this year. So just while the last few people arrive, I'm just going to go through some basic housekeeping with you. So the session is being recorded. This means that you're able to actually access the back catalogue of previous sessions on the CPD unit's YouTube channel. So I recommend you take a look at the range of the various range of sessions that are available. And although the bookings are now closed for this year's live sessions, we will be making all these sessions available on YouTube so you can go back and watch them. So IT issues. So if you have any technical issues during the session, sound issues, anything like that, then please feel free to use the chat feature, and myself or my colleague Jess will do our best to assist you. If your Wi-Fi drops out, then just reuse the link that we provided you and we'll readmit you onto the session. Jess and I will be on the sidelines, so you won't interrupt the flow of the session or anything like that. Questions and answers. So we'll be doing the questions and answers during and at the end of the session. So please make a note of what you'd like to ask the presenter and post your questions either via the Q&A chat feature at the bottom, or you can also raise your hand and we will unmute your microphone and allow you to ask your question yourself. So you've got those 2 options. You can either we read the question out for you with the Q&A tab, or you can raise your hand and you can ask the question yourself. Finally, feedback. So we'll be sending out a questionnaire at the end of the Virtual Summer School shortly after the last session on Thursday. We're really keen to keep identifying new sessions that are of interest to you, so we'd really value your feedback on this. I'm told it only takes a few minutes to fill in, and as I say, we'd very much appreciate it if you could take the time to do this. So I think that's enough from me. I'll hand you over to our fantastic speaker that we have lined up for you this morning, Professor Donald Forrester. Thanks very much, Donald.
Thank you, and thanks for inviting me to do this. I'm really impressed so many people have tuned in, because I looked out the window this morning at the sunny day and thought, I wonder how many people will come. So it's really good to see there's some people really interested in hearing about motivational interviewing and working with families. Let me just get this slide up properly. I feel I should do a slight warning. It was advertised as motivational interviewing in child and family work, and that is what the topic is. But my practice and my research has all been around social work and using motivational interviewing and working with children and families. So that is the kind of focus of the session, starting off with quite a bit about motivational interviewing, and then more thinking about how you'd apply it into child and family social work settings. But I hope in doing that, there will be things about the complicated area of child protection that may be of interest to some people. Overall, I'm going to provide a very brief introduction to child and family social work in the next slide, then a much longer talk about what motivational interviewing is, how we might understand it, and then thinking about how we could apply motivational interviewing to child and family work, particularly child and family social work. But that also gets me thinking about how we could think about helping in general in the work that social workers do, and arguing that certainly when we think about protection, child protection, it's more fundamentally about rights than helping. And in that context, how could we use counselling approaches, which are very often proposed as models or ways we could be doing work in child and family settings. And I'm going to do it just by taking you the journey I've been on. So I've been a researcher for more than 20 years now. I'm going to take you from my first studies, nearly 25 years, from my first studies through to more recent ones, not going into great detail about findings, but just things I've learned in the hope that you can learn from my mistakes and misunderstandings so that you can make your own ones rather than repeating ones that I have already helped you by making for you. So very briefly, child and family social work, most people will be at least noddingly familiar with this. So children's social care or children's services in England is provided for children at risk of significant harm or in need. There's some differences between England and Wales, but I'd say the systems are more similar than different. And in broad terms, referrals come in for families where there's thought to be a risk or a need. A worker gets allocated to, they talk to other agencies, they do work directly with families. A very high proportion of the work involves concerns about abuse and neglect. So that's obvious where there's risk of significant harm, but actually a high proportion of the need cases are also concerns about lower level, maybe neglect or maybe abuse. And whether or not they're subject to child protection or child in need, that there are quite often issues about what you might broadly call child protection, even if it's not done under that legal basis. And of course, there's also legal care proceedings and children who come into care and need to be looked after in care. So my first study, 20-something years ago, 23 years ago, I guess, looked at, as a practitioner, I was very interested in working with parents where they misuse drugs or alcohol. I had a high proportion of them on my caseload. I worked in London. I couldn't find any guidance or help or research on the area. And rather fortunately, I got my first proposal for a research study funded, which was really just to find out what proportion of the cases that social workers had involved drugs or alcohol and what happened to the families. And in a nutshell, what we found was a high proportion of all the families allocated to social worker had a parent with a drug or alcohol problem. The social workers had little or no training or sort of support about working with these issues. The outcomes were very poor, particularly where there were alcohol problems, because alcohol problems were often mixed up with all sorts of other issues like domestic abuse. I was very struck by quite a lot of social workers who felt they were just waiting for something to go wrong. They felt they weren't really helping families, they weren't making a difference, but they were worried. They were visiting families, but they struggled to engage parents because parents would deny or minimize the problems, quite resistant. So I guess this was an important study for me because, for several reasons. But one of them was I decided I didn't want to do any more studies that just described a problem. I was left feeling I've described how bad the situation is, but it's not really particularly helpful. So since then, my research has been really about trying to find solutions. How can we make practice better? I think almost all my studies have had directly or indirectly that focus. So looking at parental substance misuse, looking at social work or other services that work with parents who misuse drugs or alcohol, where their children are involved, what might be helpful? That is how I came across motivational interviewing, and I've been doing research or writing about motivational interviewing for 20 years now. Motivational interviewing seemed a good fit to the problems I had found. It was person-centered and respectful, so its values were very much those that I think social work and other helping professions should be about. It has a strong evidence base that it tends to work. I mean, that was 20 years ago, it had a strong evidence base, has a huge evidence base now. It doesn't always work. We could discuss some of the times when it tends to work or not work. Having looked at certainly dozens, maybe hundreds of studies, I'm not aware of any where the motivational interviewing made things worse. There's quite a lot where it makes things better, and there's some where it doesn't seem to make a difference, but it seems to be a sort of a way of working that tends to be helpful. I was particularly interested in the fact that it seeks to understand and work with resistance, with understanding how and why parents might appear to be denying or minimizing a problem, and providing an understanding of that and the skills that might help us to engage people. So it provides a theory for understanding how we might help people to change, and a practice that's associated with that. And finally, it was developed initially for alcohol, but it's been used with a very wide range of behavior change issues, from diet to drugs through smoking, where it doesn't seem to be as effective, a whole load of behavior change issues. And I think in crime settings, in prison settings, in places where people have to use authority as well as being counsellors. So there's a rich body of evidence that allows us to understand not just, whether it works, but how it might work, what one needs to do to help people become good at it, some of the processes involved in helping, and how it varies in different settings or needs to be adapted. So that's why I chose motivational interviewing, and why I think it remains a really good candidate for a really helpful way of helping people, and child and family social work. So now I'm going to sort of cover a bit more about what motivational interviewing actually is. So I said there's a theory of behavior change problems. Rather simplistically, I'd say in motivational interviewing, you can think of a continuum of readiness to change. So if that continuum is from not wanting to change through to really wanting to change, motivational interviewing, and indeed most helping, tends to be focused on people who are in the middle of that continuum, because the research shows that people who really don't want to change, it kind of doesn't matter what you say to them, they're not going to change. Conversely, people who really think they're going to change and want to change and are committed to doing so, actually can often change with no help or minimal help. There's a lot of studies of people with serious alcohol problems that shows once they suddenly decide to change, they can often make that change. The people we tend to be involved with professionally are people who are somewhere in the middle of that continuum, people who perhaps want to change. They can see, for instance, that their drinking's a problem for them and their children, but they have reasons for not changing, so they may not be confident, or they may feel differently at different times. So behavior change problems and behavior change help often happens where there's conflict between people's reasons for changing and reasons for not changing. From the outside, it can seem really, this can be quite perplexing. So in the field I'm involved in, drug and alcohol issues, I've worked with, when I was a social worker, I worked with, and since as a researcher, I've seen many families where you talk to the parent and their drinking is going to lead to them losing the care of the children they love. And from the outside, you're thinking, well, why don't you stop drinking? We're offering you all this help. Why don't you make the change in your life? From the inside, it can be much more complicated than that. There can be positives about drinking. There can be fear of change. And in particular, there can be a lack of confidence or self-esteem about ability to make change. Plus, there can be all sorts of social factors that reinforce difficult patterns of behavior. Perhaps all your friends or your partner or your family drink or take drugs. I think it can be really useful for when we're thinking about these issues of change to think about ourselves and the changes we want to make. There are very few people who can hand on heart say they're completely happy with their exercise regime or the way they eat. Why don't you just eat more healthily? Why don't you just get up in the morning? And this morning I was going to get up at 6:15 and go for a run. Last night, I was completely committed to doing that. When the alarm went off this morning, I decided to stay in bed because it was much more attractive. That sort of ambivalence is typical of all human beings all the time. In fact, it's harder to stick to a diet than it is long-term than it is to give up heroin. So we all deal with these behavior change issues. And the ones that are difficult are when there are pros to change. There are good things about changing that we can see, but there are also things that are difficult about it or things that we don't want to do about it. So when we consider the obviousness of the reasons for change in some of the situations we're talking about, sort of difficult child protection issues, or even in other things, sometimes when you're talking to a friend about, I don't know, if you were talking to a friend about their health, it might be very simple to see that they should, be eating more healthily or something. With both friends and certainly professionally, if you try to give people advice that they haven't asked for, or try to persuade people to change, it's a very common response that's been found in social workers, in nurses, and some types of counsellors. And in motivational interviewing, it's called the writing reflex. But the irony is, the more we do that with someone who's ambivalent, who's in the middle position, the more they push back. So the more I say to someone, wow, you should control your drinking because your children are suffering. We've started child protection and we're thinking of legal proceedings, and you're not really happy, you're depressed, and all these things. The more they are likely to be either saying to me or saying in their mind, you don't understand, alcohol's the only thing that helps me get over my bad feelings. The only people who are in my life are the people I drink with. I couldn't change even if I wanted to, and so on and so forth. Or they may be saying, well, actually, it's not that big a problem. You've made a big deal out of it. I could control my drinking if I wanted to. Why are social services always exaggerating things? The more you push, the more people will push back. That's kind of true physically. If someone pushes you a bit, you tend to push back, but it's even more true sort of emotionally. So the writing reflex is an understandable response from people who want to be helpful, but ironically, it actually tends to make things worse. So a key insight from MI is that we can increase or reduce the amount of resistance we encounter. So persuading, advising, or even arguing with people, which I've certainly seen, and not high-level arguing, but kind of arguing from social workers, the more we do that, the more resistance there will be. And at a simple level, the more we listen, the more we're empathic, the less resistance we will encounter when we're talking to someone about behavior change problems. So the foundation of motivational interviewing is good listening. It's a sort of respectful, empathic listening with open questions, with reflective and summary statements that is typical of Rogerian non-directive counselling. And so, if I was doing a workshop, we'd do quite a lot of work on these listening skills, because all of us all the time can become better listeners. So it builds on, explicitly, Bill Miller was very influenced by Carl Rogers' non-directive counselling, and it builds on the Rogerian approach in two ways. So the most obvious is the core skills of MI are those of Rogerian non-directive listening, the open questions, reflections, summary statements. They're really taken straight out of that tradition. But more importantly, the Rogerian tradition is part of a humanist approach in psychology. And the humanist approach is a broader tradition that believes in human beings, their ability to change, believes that if you provide positive, unconditional positive regard to people, you're much more likely to help them make a change. So it believes that ultimately clients, people we're working with, have got self-determination. They've got decisions to make about their lives. We cannot make them change their behavior. It's not our role, and we just can't do it. It's up to individuals to decide whether they want to change. And in that context, good listening and forming a caring, respectful relationship is the foundation of helping. And that's true for motivational interviewing, and it takes it straight out of Rogerian counselling approaches. But on its own, the problem with just listening is that where a person feels ambivalent, this sort of I want to change, but I'm not sure about changing situation, listening is better than trying to give them the arguments for change, because when we give them the arguments for change, they start to make the arguments for not changing. Listening gets rid of that kind of tension and creates a very different type of conversation. But it can lead to people going around in circles, because if the person is stuck and we are just listening to them, then eventually the conversation will start to resemble that stuckness. And that's why a crucial, the crucial sort of insight of MI that makes it different from Rogerian approaches is that it is directive. There is a strategic goal, and that is to help people change. We are not just listening. We're listening, but we're listening with a purpose. And the way I characterize this is that this is all about understanding the motivational gap. This, well, it isn't in the books on motivational interviewing. This is my way of understanding what they, or summarizing kind of what they say in those books. For me, the motivational gap is what motivational interviewing and probably all helping is all about. And it is the difference between the life you are leading and the life you want to lead. Your current behavior and how you would like to behave. The parent you are now and the parent you would like to be. How fit you are at the moment, how fit you would like to be. And that really usually takes us to fairly fundamental values. What sort of person do you want to be? What sort of parent do you want to be? Where there is a gap between those two, there is motivation for change. Where there isn't, if someone is perfectly happy with their exercise regime, amount of drinking, then it doesn't matter how you talk to them. You're unlikely to create very much change. So MI is about directively exploring with people whether there's a gap between the life they want to be leading and the life they are leading, broadly speaking. And that can obviously be applied to any specific issue. So that could be in relation to smoking or parenting or alcohol use or whatever the behavior change issue is. It explores the gap in all sorts of ways. There's various techniques for doing this. So you can ask questions about fundamental values and ideas. What sort of parent do you want to be? If you woke up tomorrow and everything was going as well as it possibly could be, what would life be like? So there are sort of techniques like rating questions that you can ask to begin to get, so, on a scale of 1 to 10, how happy are you with your life? And why is it a 6, not a 7? What would it take to get to a 7? All sorts of ways of structuring conversation, which are techniques, but they're techniques to a purpose. And the purpose is to explore whether there's a gap. Where there is a gap, in MI, we use listening skills to reflect that gap back to people. So reflective statements are really important, summary statements, really important. And then we allow people to make a decision. So in MI, there's a key question, which is ultimately you listen to a person, you explore the motivational gap, you reflect it back to them, and then you say to them some version of, what would you like to do about that? And I've certainly been in conversations where people have said, well, I don't want to do anything about it. But often if you have been exploring a gap and they can hear you reflecting back the gap that they have been describing, then suddenly they think, well, yes, I do want to make sure I start getting up in the morning and exercising. And then there's a process for supporting that decision, which is essentially using the listening skills and reviewing progress on a regular basis. But there are lots of techniques and strategies to support how we use MI, and I don't think anyone who even somebody who's very competent at MI would say they've finished learning. It's one of these things like proverbially chess, that it's fairly easy to describe the key elements of MI as it is for chess. To actually learn how to do it well in real time with real people is a challenge that takes a lifetime, I guess. So there are lots of techniques and strategies which one can become better at and learn about. But I think it's really important to say that I don't think MI is primarily about learning technical skills. I think it's about building a caring, respectful relationship and then collaboratively exploring the motivational gap. And that, again, this concept of client self-determination is fundamental, the idea that it's up to the person what changes they want to make in their life. So I think now, if we were in a room together, I'd be chatting to you, but I'm just going to offer some questions for you. And if you've got any questions now, you can put them in the chat and I'll maybe take a break and answer any that people have. But I think it's worth thinking about what theories about change inform your work. One of the things for me that was revelatory about MI was I did social work for almost 10 years in practice, and I didn't ever really have a theory about how I was helping people. I was just kind of hoping for the best. The MI theory is simple, but I found it really an effective way of thinking about how you can use talk to help people. Second point is, I think because it's so simple and because it's very much focused on initial motivation to change, it actually is very compatible with lots of other ways of helping. So there's lots and lots of research now looking at things like motivational interviewing plus cognitive behavioral therapy, or motivational interviewing plus going to Alcoholics Anonymous. So how motivational interviewing can help people get deeper types of help that they may need for specific problems. So MI can, and it often is used on its own. It's particularly effective, I think, as a brief intervention where it can, I think is effective, it's more or less effective than anything else. So it can be used on its own, but it can also be combined in longer interventions. And I guess that's also a way of thinking about it with social work. So it can be used on its own, but it can be used as part of thinking about child protection. And a couple of other questions. So how do social workers help people? How might they help people? What are social workers trying to do when they're working with people? And how might motivational interviewing help them to help people? So I see this a question in the chat, or a comment, maybe, I don't know. Sally Roberts saying, MI is compatible with coaching techniques I use as an occupational therapist. Absolutely. When I read about coaching, and then I know about MI, I'd say the principles are very similar and very compatible. So it's very usable as a coaching technique. I think it almost is a coaching technique, really. Okay. I've now lost all the questions and can't see them, but I think that was the only one. So shall I'll go on now. I should have said at the beginning, as an incentive to people to stay tuned, that I think we'll be finished by 12, just afterwards. So you will hopefully, I don't think I'll be using the whole hour and a half. Those are some questions to think about. How do people help people? How do you help people? How do social workers help people? And I'm now going to, having talked about motivational interviewing, I'm going to be thinking about how to apply it into social work and talk about some of the things we found in some of the studies I've done. So this is a prompt we used in a study. I find it impossible to believe that I now say things like 20 years ago, but it was 20 years ago. So practice may be very different now, but I think so these are prompts we gave to social workers, and we asked them how they would respond in this situation. And before I give you the prompts, I'd like you to take a moment to think how you would respond. So a 23-year-old father telephones you to say, I'm not going to be able to keep my appointment at the Child Protection Conference tomorrow. We just learned that my dad has cancer. If you were a social worker in that situation, how would you respond? Here is a fairly typical response from this study that was a long time ago. The conference is important for you to attend. Unfortunately, we can't postpone it. If you can't make it to the conference, it would be greatly appreciated. If you can make it to the conference, it would be greatly appreciated. I hope things work out for your father. So immediately we're seeing a difference between really what's taught on social work courses as the way one should respond and what people are actually saying. And I had a sort of lovely illustration of this at a local authority conference I did, where, or some of the tensions that are behind this response, where I gave this prompt and the director said, I would absolutely say we need to move the conference. And the whole room burst into laughter at the idea that a conference would be moved. And practitioners just said it's so difficult to organize a conference, there's timescales, etc. We would not move a conference. I'm not saying that's right, but it was the organizational reality of what was going on, and begins to unpick some of what's going on in relation to these responses. Second one, a 32-year-old woman says, last night Joe came home drunk again and kicked in the TV set while the kids were still watching it, and then he knocked me down. He scared us all half to death. How would you respond if you took that phone call from this woman? What might you say? Here's a fairly typical social worker response from this study from quite a while ago, though I'd have to say we're finding fairly similar findings more recently. What did you do with the children? Did you call the police? Immediately, what we've got to be asking ourselves is, why are workers responding like this? Because in textbooks, they should be doing empathic responses. What is making them go, what did you do with the children? Did you call the police? And the simple answer is a focus on child protection. So the social work is not counselling. Child and family social work is not counselling. There's a heavy emphasis on protecting children. And it leads to responses like this, which are, I guess, very much, I should say we've listened to over 800 recordings of practice now, and you get all sorts of responses. You get a very wide range, but this type of response is quite common in situations where there's a focus on protecting the children and perhaps a loss of focus on the relationship with the parents. So I'm going to do one more case study, which is based on a real situation I was in, which is you're on duty, so that's the assessment team. A referral is received of a mother who often picks up her 8-year-old child when she seems drunk. You visit and explain the nature of the referral to the mother, which I did, and then she said, "That's not true, I'm on antidepressants and they make me appear drunk. What do you think you would say next?" So I remember personally being quite flummoxed and thinking, I'm not really sure what to say at this point. What sort of response would you make if you were a social worker? Here are some responses that social workers actually made when they were presented with that situation. This is contradictory to what the school's saying. The school feel you presented drunk, and that's why we've got the referral and we're concerned. If you're saying it's the antidepressants, you need to go back to your GP and adjust the doses. It's clearly a problem. Or can I see the bottle of antidepressants? Where does it say that on the label? So these types of responses are they're not particularly helpful, but it's important that we understand why they're happening. And why they're happening is because this isn't a counselling situation. And if I had left that meeting with that mother without providing some element of challenge and exploring what was happening with the antidepressants, I would have been sent back by my manager to do the visit again, because the referral was about that, but it was about appearing drunk. And if I just accepted an account, I wouldn't have been doing my child protection job. But the problem with a response like, can I see the bottle of antidepressants, where does it say that on the label, is you painted yourself into a corner. Because if it's true, she will produce the antidepressants and your relationship will be harmed, it will be difficult to have a constructive conversation. If it's not true, which is what I suspected at the time, she's definitely not going to produce the antidepressants, she's going to sling you out of the house. So what we need is somehow to be able to listen to that and respond to it in a way that's going to be helpful, but not naive and not without challenge. And I guess the point of these prompts is simply to highlight two things. One is that the child protection focus of much child and family social work makes it very difficult to use these counselling type skills and empathy and respect and client self-determination, all the good stuff I was talking about in relation to motivational interviewing. That's fine. How do you use it when someone says, that's not true, I'm on antidepressants and they make me drunk, make me appear drunk, particularly if that person is actually lying? So I guess quite a lot of my studies have been trying to, and my thinking more recently has been trying to understand that. How do we have these conversations in ways that are helpful, but also authoritative, so where we're not pretending that we're not doing child protection. So how to understand this? Certainly child and family social work is not just about helping, and maybe it isn't even about helping. The institutional focus is on protection, and that creates profound practice challenges about what is good practice, how do we do this really difficult job. And a lot in social work courses and on local authorities, there's teaching of more kind of counselling type approaches, but how do you apply those into a tough child protection sort of conversation? So we developed a coding scheme based on MI principles, which had three factors, which could be called care and engagement, good authority, which was purposefulness, clarity about concerns and focus on the child. And we also coded for evocation, which is in motivational interviewing, it's trying to get from the person their own motivations rather than telling people what they should be motivated by. I sort of think these three dimensions are quite a good description of the three core elements of good practice in child and family social work, certainly. You need to be able to build a relationship, you need to be able to have good authority, and you need to be able to support behaviour change as appropriate. I need to develop them further. I mean, there's some evidence, which I'll talk about the difference they can make, but I think they are kind of a good description of core elements of direct practice when we meet people, communication skills when we meet people. We looked at the relationship between these skills and outcomes, and what we found is a very complicated relationship with very weak overall relationship. And that the main reason for the weakness is that, or a key reason for the weakness is that social workers often don't see very much of families, and they don't see them very often. So I'm not really sure how much we would expect social worker skills to make a difference if you're just seeing someone once a fortnight. you've got to imagine all the other things that are going on in their lives, or say once a fortnight for a couple of months, it's only 3 or 4 times you've seen them. What difference would it make? So in some ways, it's remarkable how much of a difference it makes. What we found is when social workers saw families more often, so in the small number, there was about 35 families where there were 8 or more visits, we found a much stronger relationship. I think that's for 2 reasons. One is obviously they saw more of their social workers, so the skills are more likely to make a difference. But equally important, they were probably families with real knotty problems that needed to be worked with. So those 2 things are really important. And if you're going to talk about how to ensure that social work has more of an impact, those are the 2 things I would suggest. One is working more with the families that have more serious problems and less with families where they don't, which is very easy for me to say. It's quite difficult to achieve, but certainly I think in some local authorities they're rather good at that. And then working more intensively with those where they have real problems. And then it's worth saying engagement skills were strong at predicting the quality of the relationship, which is kind of what you'd hope, but they had very little impact on any other outcomes like family functioning type outcomes. Whereas good authority and education actually had a much stronger set of correlations. So, I mean, I think that's interesting because I think we talk a lot about relationship-based practice in social work and beyond social work, and relationships are important. But on their own, relationships don't necessarily help people. It needs to be relationships plus. And I think the 2 pluses in child and family social work are good authority, which is about clarity about why you're involved and trying to have a plan to do something about it, and trying to help people change their behavior when they have an issue. So education, but probably some other skills as well that we need to develop in that dimension. But also thinking about this and the weak relationship between skills and helping for most families, and most families I don't think get helped by a social worker being allocated. A minority transforms their lives. The vast majority makes very little difference, and some it probably makes things worse. I guess I've spent a lot of time over the last few years thinking about what is the point of social work? Is the point actually to help people? And I particularly love this cartoon from the Claire in the Community series. So Rachel, the social worker, no, sorry, I've forgotten. Oh, Claire is the social worker. Is talking to her friend Rachel. Rachel, if you hate your job so much, why not change it? And do what? What about social work? It's challenging, interesting, and never routine. It offers camaraderie, a solid support system, security, and the opportunity to develop personal and professional skills on an everyday basis. I must say, I am drawn to a job where I help people. Well, okay, that's fair enough. But it's a shame, because I think you'd have made a pretty good social worker. I think this captures something about social work. It's a great job, but are we actually helping people? Most people come into social work in order to help people, and we often say the point of the service is to help people and to make a difference, but actually do we? My experience is that it is rarely like the picture here of allegedly a social worker talking to families. It's much more likely to be characterized by conflict, or at least tensions and difficulties within families. In fact, there is a sense in which where there's no conflict, families quite often don't need a social worker. They can probably get help from other places. It's often where there's some conflict about whether or not we should be involved that you need social workers, and that we get involved in kind of child protection work, if you like. Thinking about social work and helping, I think the book, most of the books and theories and models talk about social work as if it were about helping in social justice, something to do with those 2 things. And of course it is. So the international definition says social work promotes social change and development, social cohesion, and the empowerment and liberation of people. But those high words sound very different to the social work I did as a social worker and to the work I observe in all these recordings. So what is social work practice all about? Is it worth doing? What's child protection about? Why is it so full of conflict at a deeper level? And what makes it worthwhile? And I'm going to do some big picture thinking here, but don't worry, only for a couple of slides. Maybe you weren't worried. Maybe you love a bit of big picture thinking. So I think the reason we need social work goes back to the Enlightenment, which was sort of from the 18th century onwards, a movement that led to humanism, which led to, not directly, but eventually to motivational interviewing. The Enlightenment placed an emphasis on human flourishing and rational thinking, and it had core ideas around democracy, individual rights, and individual freedom. So the central idea was people should be free to do what they like so long as they don't hurt someone else. And that democratically we should protect those rights, but also make decisions collectively. And those ideas were at the core of the French Revolution, the American Revolution, and they are still being fought over today, because in the Ukraine, those defending Ukraine, those are the principles they're standing up for. People should be free to do what they want to do so long as they're not harming others. However, there are problems and challenges in making a reality of that. And one of the fundamental ones is not everyone has the full capacity to be free. Some people are just not able to exercise freedom fully. So that might include people with mental illness when it's particularly florid, people with dementia, maybe some people with learning difficulties, and all children. So none of these groups don't have any capacity for freedom and decision making. They all have some capacity, but they also all have limitations on their capacity. And that is typically when social workers become involved. And in a liberal, it creates a problem for the no harm principle, because people should be free to do what they like, but what about people who don't have full capacity to exercise such freedom? So we live in a society where, in line with the no harm principle, parents are given freedom to care for their children as they want, but with broad limitations. And this is where social workers become involved. So social work, child and family social work, is not about help primarily, not primarily about helping people. It's more about protecting and promoting the rights of individuals, and particularly when there are conflicts in rights. So we are there to protect children and protect their rights, but we are also there to protect a free society where we allow parents to have a good deal of latitude and a good deal of freedom to be a suboptimal or even quite rubbish parent without social workers becoming involved. Or there can even be conflicts between a child's wishes and their best interests. I've certainly worked with children who wanted to go home to parents and I said that they couldn't. At a more mundane level, I've worked with teenagers as a social worker and as a parent, where I've had to say, you may want new trainers, but you can't have them. So very different from a sort of counselling role. So sometimes we're helping people, because sometimes they may be having problems that make exercising their rights difficult. We can certainly provide practical or social help. We can refer them on to other agencies. We may help them get rehoused. We can talk to them about behaviour change issues or about difficult decisions in their lives. So helping is part of what we do, and we are needed as part of a good society, but there's more to it than helping. Social work is, if social work is about rights, how can we do it well? Rights-based practice is not counselling. So one of the questions is, why do we teach counselling all the time? And is there a place for motivational interviewing, which I've spent a lot of time studying myself? I'd say there's relatively little literature on the details of rights-based practice. There's quite a lot on the theory of it, but less on the detail, and certainly the detail at the individual level. So there's more about how we can help people organise collectively. So my take on it, having studied motivational interviewing, is that a rights-based practice, when working with individuals and families, is centrally concerned with creating and resolving dialogues about potentially conflicting perspectives. So we aren't trying to counsel people, we're trying to understand their perspective and potentially present the perspective of the state or society and create a dialogue between the two in order to create a safety plan to help children. I think MI is really well placed for helping us with this, because there's an extensive literature in MI on how to elicit a person's perspective at a deep level, so to really respect and understand their point of view. There's a lot of literature about how to create a dialogue. Because it's directive, it certainly has an emphasis on listening skills, but it also has an emphasis on how you could give advice, how you could have a different perspective, how you can turn the difference into a dialogue. And a lot of practical strategies for how to manage an interview in respectful ways. So how you can make sure an interview is a two-way process. It's not just listening. It's also not just telling people. It's creating a dialogue between the two. So I think MI is particularly rich in those insights. So it provides a great description of key skills that I think we need to do rights-based practice, but the reason for that is not accidental. It is because conceptually the focus on individual self-determination that underlies motivational interviewing and came up through the humanist tradition directly descends from the Enlightenment ideals, and so does social work and the individual rights I'm talking about. So there is some evidence this produces positive outcomes, but even if it didn't produce positive outcomes, I think these are the types of ways we need to be working with people, because I think the worth of something like social work or child protection in our society is not created simply by or solely by the outcomes it produces. So in conclusion, and less than an hour, so there will be time for questions if people have some. Social work, I think, is most fundamentally about protecting and promoting rights and freedoms, particularly when they're in conflict. To do it well, we need to do it with respect, care, crucially a sense of purpose, so it's purposeful practice, and a plan. And the reason for that is that's because it's what those we work with deserve. It's what we would want if we were receiving a social work service. And that's because that's the sort of society we want, where if, as a parent, there are concerns about our parenting, we would want help that was respectful, caring, had a sense of purpose and a plan, but was also authoritative. And I think MI allows us to do this. So the reason we need rights-based social work and that MI provides a foundation for this is, for those we work with, it provides the service we would want and the service that is most likely to be helpful. For society, it allows us to protect individual rights and liberty and create the sort of society we can be proud of. And for social workers and those working in the field of child protection, it helps us understand the conflict and challenge that is hardwired into the work, provides ways of managing that conflict in ways that are likely to be more productive, and allows us to be proud of the difference we make, which is not just about helping people, but more fundamentally, it's about creating a humane, respectful society that takes the individual rights of children and parents seriously. So that's the end of my talking bit, and I'm open for any questions.
Thanks very much, Donald. That was really interesting. We've had a couple of questions come in, but I very much encourage if anyone else would like to post some questions. I've used the Q&A tab if you'd like to write those out, or use your raise hand tab if you would like to ask them yourself. So we've got a question here from David Young. Thank you, Donald. Please, could you discuss the use of MI in an acute setting, for example, empowering a parent to support a child with a newly acquired injury or disability? Thank you.
Yeah, is it possible that David could talk to that question, because I've not worked in an acute setting, and I'd really be interested in where the question comes from. So I suspect I'm not going to be able to answer it, but I'd really be interested in what the issues are from David's point of view. Is that a possibility? David, are you there? Do you want to?
He's raised his hand.
Yeah.
Yes, if you're able to unmute David, that would be fantastic. Yeah. Thanks, David.
Hi there. Hopefully you can hear me now, Donald.
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So my question really comes from a perspective of not social work. I'm a children's physiotherapist, and I work particularly with children who have acquired injuries or traumatic injuries, and trying to empower and support parents to deliver rehabilitation effectively. So I think it might go alongside what the occupational therapist earlier said around coaching as well. But what I was reflecting on is that when you were speaking about supporting parents who have drinking sort of problems and things, that could be seen as more of a chronic sort of concern, whereas in the acute setting where there's a newly acquired injury, how would motivational interviewing be applied there? Yeah,
well, there's quite a lot of evidence about MI being used in acute settings. So quite a lot of and in brief interventions, I think the shortest so far as 4 or 5 minutes, which was with GPs. So, and was found to be a more effective way of having a helpful conversation, even in a 5-minute sort of window. So it can be used on one-off occasions. It can be used in longer term work. I mean, I think it can be used for almost any type of helping, but it is particularly, I guess, indicated if there is some ambivalence. So if you were working with parents where, I'm imagining most parents just really want to do the best for their kids, but some seem to struggle to do it. is that the sort of situation you're talking about, David?
Yeah, I think that would be fair to say. I think you know, as you've reflected on, you have a whole range of people that you work with, but particularly in an acute setting, perhaps the sudden nature of the circumstances and the crisis that they're in might affect their ability to sort of make reasoned judgments and things like that.
Yeah. So I think the MI approach would be really well suited to that, in that it would allow you to explore the ambivalence that may be present there. So their feelings, the challenges ahead, they may be, I'm guessing, anxious or worried or feel they just can't do it, allowing them to explore that, decide what it is that they want, see if there's a gap between what they would like to be doing and what they were actually able to do. And then, as in social work, so MI was sort of developed for counselling, where it's about the person behaviour changing, but in social work, and I presume occupational therapy, we can also offer things. So we may be saying, it sounds like you need some help that we could provide, and then maybe some changes you think you want to make, type of thing. So it sounds quite similar, I guess. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for that.
So there's two more questions I can see, both of which. So Kimberly Kenworthy has asked, do I know any resources to learn more about MI? There are lots. The book by Miller and Rolnick, sort of Motivational Interviewing Handbook, is a fantastic, very easily accessible resource. So I think it's the starting point. I've written a book about motivational interviewing in child and family social work, which, you know, I have to plug. And then there's quite a lot of, in fact, I think Sean and others and myself will probably put some things onto the call where there's quite a lot of online resources. It's quite well supported. Sally Roberts is asking a really interesting question about, and I don't know if you'd like to answer it, talk to it, Sally, or just have me speak. But if you can be unmuted, it's always good to hear from people, because people must be bored of my voice. So Sally, do you want to speak?
Sally, so we don't just sort of unmute you randomly. Do you want to raise your hand if you'd like to speak, and we can unmute you? But if you would rather not, we can just...
You can keep it down if you don't want to. The question while Sally's deciding on... Oh,
there we are.
Yeah, fantastic.
That's approval there. So yeah, please, Jess.
Thank you. Sorry, I was struggling. I missed the beginning, so I was struggling to work out how to unmute myself. Hello, thank you, Donald. No, the question I had was, I was interested when you proposed that actually the most impact was the good authority and the evocation. Was that, did you see a link between the good relationship building in the first place? So was that necessary in the first place?
Yeah. Well, the honest answer is no. I thought we would, and it wasn't like that, partly because the research wasn't designed to do that, but I think the main reason is the way we define good authority was in a kind of MI vision of good authority. So it certainly wasn't, you know, telling people what to do. It was very much collaboratively building a plan and being clear what concerns were about the child. So I think that those were so much stronger than empathy on its own, that I think that's why we saw the stronger relationship. But despite the fact I have no real research evidence to support this, basically I think what it is you need to be able to build a relationship and use good authority and help in behavior change. Kind of, they're all linked and they can happen at the same time, but conceptually those are the three steps. So you need to be able to build a relationship in order to use good authority. I suppose that the flip side of that is it's really unhelpful if a social worker or someone else thinks I'm going to build a relationship by not being clear about concerns.
Yeah.
Because families know there are concerns, and also that it's really terrible for a family if they discover you were concerned about something but you didn't tell them for a while. Mm-hmm. They'd much rather you were open and honest. Yeah. Does that answer the question?
No, that's interesting, because I mean, for me, I was just trying to unpick really the good authority, because I think for me it's about transparency and that clarity of what your role is. And I guess because I've done motivational interviewing courses in the past with Steve on a regular basis, but yeah, the more I've used it, the more I've felt that actually you can use it in a kind of brief scenario. Because when I first started using it, I was very skeptical about whether organizational constraints would stop me using it in its best way. And I think it's proved to be the opposite. It's actually one of the only techniques that I've found that when I've got restrictions around how long I can spend with somebody, or that I've only got to block an episode of work I can do with somebody, I can actually use it and see quite quick results if I've picked the right family to use it with.
Right, yeah. What sort of context are you doing that work in? That sounds really interesting.
I work with families with young people who are neurodivergent. So I'm a lecturer in occupational therapy, but I do some independent work for a charity. And often it's about, I feel very strongly that a lot of the neurodivergent young people I work with shouldn't really be in and out of services, and the majority of the time they work really well, but often their perception of capability and their family's perception of capability is such that it stops them being empowered to do that, and they keep dipping back into services because they're looking for that reassurance, they're looking for that. So often services have only got short periods of episodes of intervention they can do, or they can only do certain things. So I was skeptical initially that I could do anything within the third sector and make a difference, but actually motivational interviewing for me is one of the techniques that's been the most useful, alongside other coaching techniques that you can see quite quick change and change in perceptions of capability, I guess, which we know helps with behavioural change or occupational change in my case. Yeah,
that's really, really helpful, and it's good to have other people saying MI is good, not just myself. I must publish this analysis, but we looked at the length of meetings and a level of MI skill for this kind of reason, that often when I train people in motivational interviewing, social workers say they learn the listening skills and they say, well, I don't have time for all this listening, it takes too long, and building a relationship takes too long. And what we found is that in fact, the interviews with higher levels of MI skill took less long than those with low levels of MI skill. And the reason is because if you try to persuade people, give them advice, tell them what to do, even you're in a rush and you think that's a quick way of getting the stuff over, but you end up creating so much resistance that the interviews actually take longer. So softer skills can be more effective and save time, I think, because they're genuinely collaborative.
So we've got a question here from Deborah Dryfield, and then I think Helen Wales, you've got your hand raised. So we'll take the one from Deborah first, but Helen, if you get yourself ready, we're going to unmute you after Deborah's question. So Deborah asks, do you know of any CS where they have a whole system approach to?
Yeah, so I do. The family safeguarding approach, which was first developed in Hertfordshire, then rolled out to 6, and now I think it's in 20-something local authorities in England. It's a whole system approach. It has multiple components. So I think a key part of it is having specialist mental health, substance misuse and domestic abuse workers in child and family social work teams, or shared between teams. But the core approach that everyone gets trained in and that they try to support is motivational interviewing. And that has been shown pretty convincingly to reduce the number of children in care, and certainly practitioners report very positively about that as a way of working with families. So I mean, I love MI, but I suppose partly I think with a lot of these methods, if you look down, they actually have a lot of similarities, because there's no secret to how to help people. So MI has a lot of similarities when you really look at it to restorative practice or systemic practice. So I try not to be MI is the one true way. The way I think of it is, it's a bit like they're each musical instruments. So let's say MI is the piano and restorative practice is the guitar, and others are others. It matters less what model you choose than how much the system commits to becoming really good at it, and how much and the same for individuals, how much the individual really commits to becoming good at it. So it's much better to be really good and really committed to becoming great at motivational interviewing than to have a little bit of everything, which I think is a problem in quite a lot of social work courses. Bill Miller, one of the creators of MI, said, so there's quite a lot of evidence that a 2-day training course in MI, and actually I think this is true for other methods, there's two things. One is it has almost no effect on your actual skills in practice, but it has a big increase in how good you think you are. And he said it's a bit like inoculating people against becoming actually good, because they begin to think they're good, but they're not. So what we need for individuals and for systems is a real wholehearted commitment to becoming really good at whatever framework they think is the right framework. Does that make sense? Was there another question?
I think Helen's actually lowered her hand now.
Oh,
So
sorry, no, do you want to say something, Helen?
I think yeah, that's fine. I think that's all of the questions that we've had now. Sean's very kindly put some really useful links in the chat, which I'm hoping everyone can see. So there's a link to a book there. There's a link to a YouTube video from the co-founder of MI, and also the link to Cascade Research Centre as well. So I very much encourage people, if they get the opportunity before this Zoom session ends, that they just copy and paste those into their browser if they would like to have a look at those. I think that's all the questions for now, unless anyone would like to post anything else. I can't see anything else coming through.
Well, I'm impressed people have stayed this long, because it's a sunny day outside. I said we'd be shorter, so I think, you know, an hour is probably long enough to be in front of the computer screen, and I hope I bought you, some people at least, I bought myself an extra half hour where I can put my feet up and maybe get outside. So if there's any final questions, the other thing is, some people don't like to ask questions in a group. If you want to email me, I'm always happy to get emails after a presentation. So if you want to email me, that would be great.
Brilliant. I think we can conclude the session there then. So I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their afternoons. Thank you very, very much to Donald. That was a really insightful, interesting presentation. I'm sure everyone enjoyed it as much as I have. And yeah, thank you very much, everyone. We look forward to hearing from you if you want to email us directly. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye. Cheers.